All right. That was Offend by Ringmaster. There we go. Hello, everybody. I'm CheeseSlice. I am the engineer and producer of Uncontrolled Opposition. And today our guest is going to be Kit Klarenberg. Let's go ahead and bring on our hosts, Gloria and Jayme. Hello, Gloria. Hello,
Hey,
Jayme. And we're going to be recording an hour for the radio for WBAI and the Progressive Radio Network. And let's go ahead and bring on our guest, Kit. Hello, Kit.
How are you? Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Kit.
Very good to see you. All right. So this is Gloria and Jayme's show. I'm going to hand it off to them, and we're going to start recording right now.
Brilliant.
Hey, everyone. Welcome to Uncontrolled Opposition, where together we battle mind wars with truth strikes. I'm Gloria Guillo, an investigative journalist, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor Jayme Kuzmarov, managing editor of Covert Action magazine. Our producer and engineer is Jayme CheeseSlice. Today's guest is the intrepid Kit Klarenberg, investigative journalist and activist. The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. Since today's guest, Kit Klarenberg, has written extensively on Israel in his recent articles, we want to open the show by sharing our perspective on the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Two polarizing narratives dominate most debates, and neither captures reality, in our opinion. One alleges that Israel controls Washington, the other that Washington controls Israel. Our position is different. We understand that both nation states are managed by a predator class that includes bankers, tech titans, and global asset managers like BlackRock. We stand by class analysis to frame domestic and geopolitical issues. We acknowledge how propaganda, controlled opposition, and infiltration have erased the anti-war movement in the United States, and we have witnessed how fear of illness and death can be weaponized to easily overcome reason, logic, and even love. Recall that under C-19 narrative, even beloved grandparents that were unvaxxed suddenly became disease-spreading enemies to their own families. Consider the example of social influencer Charlie Kirk. When the assassination of a 31-year-old family man is celebrated simply because his views, mostly taken out of context, are disliked, it shows how far spiritual decay has spread in our country. How then can we, in all fairness, expect Israeli citizens indoctrinated by by mandatory military service and a warped educational system that dehumanizes Palestinians not to fall for Netanyahu's narrative that only he stands between them and extinction? Judgment should be tempered, for similar dynamics exist on all sides. As taxpayers, we are also guilty of every death in Gaza. Even in American protest culture, polarization reigns. On campuses, students demand Israelis resist their government, and many do, yet they themselves cannot unite across imaginary left and right lines because of divisive purity tests. Jacqueline Lugman's Anti-War So White article helped to gut efforts to build a united anti-war coalition that might have spared Ukrainians from becoming cannon fodder in Washington's proxy war with Moscow. Since the worldwide lockstep C-19 narrative, the deployment of World Economic Forum's young global leaders, and the expansion of the CIA's venture capitalist arm, In-Q-Tel, the world's become a techno-totalitarian grid where sovereign nation states have become appendages. Within this context, the United States brings the muscle, weapons, and Israel supplies the brains, surveillance technology, and police force training. Leaders like Trump and Netanyahu remain in place because they serve predator class interests. If they step out of line, they risk elimination. We have seen this. Trump was grazed by a bullet. Whether or not this was staged is irrelevant, considering the assassination of multiple Kennedys, other politicians, business leaders, and social influencers. The cost of war is undeniable. Israel's wars with Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran drained over $30 billion in a single year. The deficit swelled close to 8% of GDP. By late 2023, output collapsed nearly 20% on an annualized basis. Ordinary Israelis now endure higher taxes, shrinking services, and poverty rates near 1 in 5. Daily life has collapsed. 300,000 reservists were pulled from jobs. Tourism has been erased. Agriculture gutted. Children have been hit hardest. Families face austerity at home while funding war abroad. Conflict has buried dissent. Before October 7th, mass protests filled the streets demanding Netanyahu's removal. They opposed his assault on judicial independence and his decision to provide Big Pharma with Israeli health data, which turned his constituents into lab rats. That movement to remove Netanyahu was extinguished under emergency powers. Whether October was a false flag, October 7th was a false flag, or catastrophic intelligence failure, the results were identical. Protests were silenced, surveillance became more entrenched, and executive power expanded. This is not new. From the Balfour Declaration onward, Israel has been conceived by wealthy Europeans as a flashpoint to fracture the region and protect imperial interests. That legacy endures. Consider that Israel is not merely an ally, but a laboratory for techno-authoritarian control. Biometric IDs, digital health passes, and facial recognition, first deployed in Gaza and the West Bank, are now normalized nationwide. As goes Gaza, goes us all. Recall that conflict creates justification. Justification enables rollout. Rollout ensures permanence. At root, this is class struggle. Israeli reservists forced out of work, Palestinian families killed and displaced in mass, and American taxpayers footing the bill. All are casualties of the same system. We share the inflation, the austerity, and the lost futures, while politicians, defense contractors, surveillance firms, and financiers capture the profits. Consider that the United States sends nearly $4 billion a year in military aid to Israel. Officially, it funds procurement, but in practice, money cycles back. U.S. tax dollars go out, while lobbying groups and PACs channel donations into Washington to secure continued aid. The effect is circular. Public funds sustain a client abroad, and private funds reinforce patrons at home. Nor is this unique. Watchdogs like Moneyval have flagged the Vatican Bank for weak anti-money laundering controls, while the Financial Action Task Force has pressured Israel over its vulnerabilities. In both cases, institutions cloaked in faith or security double as conduits for laundering and recycling capital. Battles can't be considered won if the working class becomes impoverished, more indebted, and more controlled. Kit, please tell our audience a little bit about yourself. Your 2023 arrest or detainment in Britain by 6 armed counter-terror officers who questioned you about your journalism. Then let's get into your most recent articles. Thank you. Kit, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, that's odd. So yes, I mean, just very briefly, my name's Kit Klarenberg. I'm a journalist. I focus on the Anglo-American Empire, old and new, and the machinations of Western intelligence services, their influence on politics and perceptions globally. This has not made me many friends in Langley or the offices of MI6 in Vauxhall in London. And so, yeah, I have since 2019 lived in Serbia. I flew back in May 2023 because I received news that a close relative of mine was extremely unwell and might not be long for this world. I wouldn't have had any particular desire to fly back to that godforsaken island otherwise. And then yes, as we were pulling into Luton Airport, which is one of the worst airports in the world, actually.
Which airport?
Luton. It's god awful. But anyway, the point is,
what city is that?
I mean, it's like, I mean, it serves London, but it's like not near the city. It's not anywhere near the city, but it is officially called London Luton Airport. But the point is, yes, as we were pulling in, as we were landing, the captain said over the tannoy, everyone have your IDs ready or your passports ready for checking, because border control are waiting for our arrival. And I thought that was quite strange. But in my call it bloody-minded naivety, I didn't think that they were looking for me specifically, but they were. And yes, there was. It wasn't just border force; it was armed counter-terror police, as you mentioned, waiting for me very specifically. I was then taken to a back room in Luton Airport, which was windowless and airless, and I was given the delightful choice of facing arrest or I could undertake a 6-hour interrogation or questioning, is the slightly more euphemistic phrasing they used, in which I would have no right to silence. I would have to answer any question put to me, no matter how sensitive or personal, and I would have to hand over the PIN codes to my phones, to my SIM cards, any of my digital devices. And so, because I thought I had nothing to hide, I picked the latter option. And then what proceeded was 6 hours of intensive grilling about every aspect of my personal and professional life. Very intrusive questions asked about my up to and including my love life, which was deeply unpleasant. But their preponderant interest was my work for the Grayzone.
Wait, your love life is unpleasant, or the question?
No, the question. I mean,
It was a joke. It was a joke. Sorry, it was just a joke. It was a bad joke.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Anyway, the point is that their preponderant interest was my work for the Grayzone, specifically my work on the war in the proxy war in Ukraine. And I very early on, pretty much from the very start of this, was reporting on how Britain was leading this effort, the effort in Ukraine. I was laughed at. The Grayzone was mocked for suggesting that Britain, which is this vassal of the US, would have any sway in the war. Since then we've published more leaks, documenting in extensive detail how Britain was behind planning for all manner of suicidal Ukrainian operations, how they are behind the war on Russia's Black Sea fleet for their own geopolitical, to serve their own geopolitical objectives, using Ukrainians as cannon fodder and as proxies to achieve these ends. And not long ago, the Times of London published an expose acknowledging that Britain is seen as the brains of the war by Kiev. If Britain is the brains of anything, I think we need to be extremely worried. But it was a deeply unpleasant experience, and I thought that the backlash against this might serve as a deterrent to further harassment of fellow journalists and dissidents by the British state. It has only ratcheted since then. Since my detention, David Miller, who's an academic who's done extraordinary work on unraveling the international Zionist lobby, which I'm sure we'll get into in due course. He got stopped recently. Craig Murray, former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, turned whistleblower, and a journalist himself, got detained, charged with terror offences. That was then dropped. Richard Medhurst last summer was flying through London, not to the UK, but through London, and was arrested coming off the plane, and has had to fly back from his home in Vienna to London at regular intervals to answer, to have his bail refreshed while investigations into him are ongoing. He's also been raided in his adopted home country of Austria. My friend Asa Winstanley, he had his door, he was subject to a dawn raid and had all of his devices seized, which has subsequently been found to be illegal. The list goes on and on and on. There is, and we see now with the banning of Palestine Action, which is just this completely insane escalation. It's the first time in history, well, modern history at least, that a non-violent protest group has been prescribed as a violent extremist group. And British terror laws are very broad, so you can be charged with supporting Palestine Action simply by saying I don't think they should be banned. And despite the fact that I, do not live in the UK, I myself am careful about the way I talk about certain issues related to Gaza, because senior British security officials have stated openly, we will deport people based on what they say online, if we feel it's suitably egregious. And like I say, the terms of British legislation related to terrorism, which I think is a meaningless concept anyway, but that's a discussion for another time perhaps, and national security are ludicrously overbroad, to the extent that national security can mean pretty much literally anything they want it to. Reporting on the corrupt criminal activities of British businesses abroad could be categorized as a national security matter, and thus reporting on it could be effectively criminalized. It's a very worrying milieu in which people like myself operate. And I certainly, I would not put myself in the same league as people like my editor, Max Blumenthal, or my friend and colleague at the Grayzone, Aaron Mate. I would see myself as a relatively minor figure in the scheme of things. But this is there is no one too meager in stature for the British state to go after. We've seen hundreds and hundreds of people arrested for supporting Palestine action, in some cases because they wore T-shirts that didn't mention the group but said, "You stop the genocide in Palestine," and then this was categorized as a terror offense. I mean, it's completely insane. And my advice to anyone of dissident politics still living there would be to get out as soon as you possibly can. Outlets like Electronic Intifada and Declassified UK, they are doing incredible work, uncovering all sorts of secrets and exposing inconvenient truths, particularly about Britain's direct involvement in the Gaza genocide. I know for a fact that their contributors are ever ready for that knock on the door from the police, just for the crime of telling the truth.
And is that one question? I mean, historically, is this something that has worsened? I mean, or is this a pattern historically where journalists and dissidents in UK were treated in this way?
Well, I mean, I think that the problem, there are numerous problems that the British state finds itself in now, which is, for a very long time, they have had a variety of mechanisms for controlling what the mainstream media reports, and that those mechanisms have become more powerful and more entrenched over time. But the issue is social media and the internet. Right, and it's not, the global the global internet is not something that they can fully police, although they would like to, certainly, and there are pushes in this direction. So, for instance, the one of the ways that Britain has managed to keep journalists, if you can even call them that, in line historically, is through a mechanism known as the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee. Now, this is a little known but hugely influential body. It's run out of the Ministry of Defence. It is staffed by veterans of the military, Britain's foreign and domestic spying agencies, and representatives of the government. And they have a very close relationship with journalists and editors. And if they think a story is going to be published, or a story has been published, which they don't want in the public domain, they will send very polite letters to the editors of major newspapers and news channels and say, could you please seek our advice before reporting on this? And theoretically, this has no legal force, so they can't literally, under threat of prosecution, tell you to not report on this particular thing. But in practice, it's never broken, because journalists know that there are going to be one way or another consequences if they don't comply. I mean, this could mean they get cut out of briefings, they don't get given exclusives, there's a black mark against their name, they're viewed as troublemakers, words will be had with their editors, and they might, lose their jobs. So that's been very effective for a very long time in ensuring that there is this veil of secrecy about what the British state does, not only abroad, but at home as well. Now, I think that since the war in Ukraine began, but particularly since the Gaza genocide erupted nearly 2 years ago now, oh my God, I think it has gotten considerably worse, because there are a large number of people, including average citizens, who have opinions that the British state does not want in the public domain. I think, aside from Peter Hitchens, for example, I mean, he's the Mail on Sunday, a veteran journalist and a Mail on Sunday columnist, I have not seen any dissent whatsoever in a mainstream British newspaper about the proxy war in Ukraine. Like, to the extent that finally now outlets are acknowledging that this is an unwinnable quagmire, the narrative remains, well, we still need to keep helping them anyway, and we still need to stand by them. Consider any acknowledgement that, maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the wisest idea to funnel unaccountably vast amounts of weapons and money into the most corrupt country in Europe, with a serious problem with neo-Nazism, where the far right, while it is small, it represents a very small proportion of the population and doesn't represent average Ukrainians' opinions. They have an outsized role and power within Ukrainian politics and society. Maybe this wasn't very wise, and maybe there's going to be blowback from this. But I mean, there's no consideration of that.
And the Guardian seems to have been the worst. Just to interrupt you for one sec, the so-called left magazines in Britain, like Guardian, were the worst on this issue. Anyway, continue. Yeah.
No, absolutely, and I think that I mentioned Declassified UK, one of their very first investigations, and I would urge all of your viewers and listeners to check this out. It was about how the DSMA committee, which I just mentioned, brought the Guardian to heel, because they started publishing the Snowden leaks in 2013. The DSMA committee wrote to British newspapers and said, don't go near this, and they didn't. The Guardian was the only outlet in the UK to publish this huge anything on this huge scandal, which is of international significance and got picked up in every corner of the world. And subsequent to this, the committee got its hooks into the Guardian. The Guardian's investigations team's got shut down. Many of its kind of muckraking veteran reporters, like people like Ian Cobain and Jonathan Steele, they got fired. Now a lot of their output, if not all of their output on the security intelligence services, is puff pieces, like a chummy sit down interview with the head of MI5. I made this point before, that for all of its countless faults, at least in the US, that certain matters related to national security, civil liberties infringements, police brutality, and matters like that, sometimes they do get reported on in the US media. In the UK, never. With any degree of seriousness whatsoever. And I think that again, for all of its faults, the US does have a culture of free speech. It has protections that other countries lack, enshrined in law. Fight to defend and hold on to those for dear life. because you don't want a situation where people are, although the Trump administration does seem to be moving in this direction in regard to Israel, that you don't want a situation where people can be arrested for holding a Palestine flag. Or like in Germany, where like particular chants have been banned, it's a completely insane situation.
Well, one of the things that our previous guest, John Kiriakou, who I believe you also know, had mentioned is that there's the technology that his name can be buried through an algorithm. So anything he does just never hits media. So it's kind of seamless the way the United States also is able to control dissent.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know John, and I consider him a friend. But I think that the algorithmic suppression and other kind of soft forms of censorship are very much in place with dissident voices. So, for instance, when you Google somebody's name, the first things that come up in a Google search are their Twitter account and or their Substack. You can't find my Substack or my Twitter using Google. Like you can find a lot of very negative comments about me via search engines, but what would be standard when Googling somebody's name does not come up searching mine. Which is quite extraordinary, really. And I think as well that this is probably going to get worse. The chokehold on information wielded by the US by token of major tech giants like Facebook and Google effectively being wings of the US government is really quite extraudinary. And I think that even though in parts of the world like China and Russia and in Asia more widely, that influence is waning. It remains ascendant throughout the West, like US dominance of the internet. And I mean, we've just seen a potential color revolution in Nepal, where at the core of what kind of lit the spark that ignited the government's overthrow in a matter of just a few days was Nepal was attempting to create its own internet ecosystem for the purposes of digital sovereignty. So it wanted to be able to block certain foreign sites, collect taxes from major social media platforms that operate in the country because they were because they weren't previously. Very common tactic for Facebook to claim, oh well, we don't actually make any money in the UK, so we shouldn't pay any taxes, even though it's a massive source of revenue for them anyway. The point is, sorry, just to finish this point, is that that basically that Nepal was attempting to create its own, similar to like China's what's derisively dubbed the Great Firewall, which has led to China developing its own e-commerce, social media, and other online resources, which are enormously popular. Nepal was moving to do the same, and the major US tech firms refused to play ball with them. A large number of civil society organizations funded by National Endowment for Democracy, Open Society Foundations, Meta, Google, Microsoft, started basically calling for the government's ouster, and then that happened. This follows in February this year, the National Endowment for Democracy publishing a report explicitly stating that there is a real threat that other countries will copy China's model and get their own internet, and therefore weaken US control of their information spaces.
Very interesting. Yeah, that kind of answers my question. I was going to ask about Nepal because the only reports we get, even alternative media, and that's one reason we started this podcast, because the alternative media in the U.S. is so bad and show that we can't mention on air. They were heralding a Gen Z protest in Nepal, and it's just like heroic triumph of the student movement, just like in Bangladesh. They were doing the same I mean, we've seen a lot of color revolutions just in the last year or two, Bangladesh. So maybe you can say something more about that. And you've done really remarkable reporting on this. And now in the Nepal case, from my understanding, it was a Maoist government. Was it not a more left-leaning government that's been toppled? So maybe just say something a little more about Nepal and the biased media coverage you've seen, and also the broader pattern over the last couple of years, how Nepal compares to like Bangladesh and a couple other countries you've reported on.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that Nepal's an interesting case because, yes, in theory, it has a revolutionary left-wing government. On the other hand, there is extensive penetration by Western foundations. USAID was massively involved in all sorts of governance projects, etc. I mean, of course, USAID doesn't exist anymore. I think that the government wasn't following China's successful economic model. And there was, legitimate grievances among young Nepalese citizens. I mean, as there is, talk about legitimate grievances of, most people that I know who still live in the UK, and most of my friends in the US as well, of all ages. But there was a significant proportion of the population who was unhappy with corruption, with poor employment opportunities, poor wages, and a variety of other factors. And so I do think that there were certainly people who were out protesting who were fully sincere. What gives me pause, though, is what you've got to bear in mind is that at the fore, we've been told that the Gen Z protests are leaderless, but there is this one particular group that's at the very forefront and is getting a lot of media coverage called Hami Nepal. Now, Hami Nepal is this hitherto completely unknown NGO with no history of political activism that suddenly emerged, and it was set up to provide food, medical, financial, and other forms of aid to victims of earthquakes, which are very common in Nepal, and disadvantaged communities in the country. And suddenly they started organizing for a major anti-government protest and set up all sorts of resources to train people in how to protest, and a helpline for people interested. And they organized via a Discord server, and the Discord chat was full of all sorts of messages about how people wanted to kill politicians and their children. So they're not quite the fluffy, friendly organization that they're portrayed as. But even more suspiciously, like on their own website, they have a list of quote unquote brands that support us, and it's like, luxury Western hotels in Nepal, Coca-Cola, Viber, the Israeli messaging app, a British Ministry of Defence funded charity for the Gurkhas being these elite fighting forces that have fought with the British Army for centuries, the Students for a Free Tibet, which is one of many separatist groups in Tibet financed by NED. So that's quite suspect, and I think that they also have a relationship with a local, kind of a notorious local gun runner called Deepak Batta, who has a history of procuring weapons for Nepal's military, and allegations of corruption have dogged him for many years. So yeah, it's very interesting, kind of looking at the Western coverage of this is like, oh yeah, all of these all of these students just banded together and overthrew their government, and it's like, well, there's something clearly, like Nepal's a country of like 30 million people, It's just inconceivable to me that like just some impassioned youth groups could have just gotten together completely spontaneously and organically, and yes, overthrown their government with expert precision within a matter of days. I mean, it's just, and at the forefront, leading them is this completely unknown group, which happens to have uncertain relationships with, yes, like Western corporations and NED finance groups. It's very suspicious, and I think as well another aspect of this that has kind of perked my suspicions is that the Gen Z protesters are now in talks with the military about the future shape of Nepal, and the military has sought to invite sought to include a local kind of fascist local businessman who supports the restoration of Nepal's absolute monarchy, which a lot of people died and were jailed trying to overthrow because it exerted absolute control over the country. All dissent was crushed for decades after its quote-unquote independence from Britain. Oh, I might add as well that BBC Media Action, which is this, it's allegedly the charitable wing of the BBC. I wrote recently for the Grayzone about how it creates factual quote-unquote and entertainment programming to achieve behavior change in audiences, and it talks about how it has produced radio dramas listened to by millions of people in Africa that made them vote differently, and it's quite clearly concerned with psychological warfare influencing how people think and act. It has 15 offices around the world, just 15. And Nepal happens to be one of the countries where they have an office, which is again like quite striking. Why? Why is Nepal considered a priority for a British information warfare unit?
Yeah, and what are some of the other countries that did you write a lot on Bangladesh or some of the other color revolutions you might compare this to?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's like, I mean, the point to make as well is that, like, if you go back 20 years, right, like, and at the start of the 2000s, this is when the color revolution trend kicked off, and it kicked off in Yugoslavia, and they got rid of Slobodan Milosevic that way, and then ever since, those same strategies have been used again and again and again to dislodge governments, and usually at the forefront of color revolutions are youth groups. They are the regime change foot soldiers, or at least the public face of a palace coup, which can then be presented to the world as some grassroots rebellion of disaffected young people who want a better, more westernized future. Yes, like you mentioned Bangladesh, as Wyatt Reed and myself at the Grayzone reported last year, based on leaked National Endowment for Democracy documents. NED had a specific program of trying to destabilize Bangladesh's politics, and they did so via extensive civil society penetration, sponsorship of LGBT groups, rappers, and all sorts. And a lot of these groups ended up at the forefront of Bangladesh's what was effectively a military coup, but they were the public face of it, like last year. And I think that in terms of a wider, and also the year before, 2022, we saw a US directed military coup against Imran Khan in Pakistan, and he's been jailed despite mass public support for releasing documents proving that the US ordered his removal because of his quote-unquote aggressive neutrality on Ukraine. It's really quite extraordinary, but I think that the point is as well, in terms of the wider geopolitical context, like Nepal is on the border of India and China. Now, Trump recently stated, well, we've lost India to China because of their refusal to cut their refusal to sanction Russia, their refusal to bow to threats of tariffs, their refusal to reduce trade with China. So like Nepal being situated between the borders of these now effectively two US enemy states, and indeed, yes, with a history of producing some of the most fearsome special forces units in the world in the form of the Gurkhas, that could be a source of major irritation for China and India, just for the sake of tying up their enemies in endless battles. I mean, it's a historical analogy to use would be, Georgia in 2003 had its Rose Revolution, which was a NED, CIA, USAID and Soros orchestrated through and through. Thereafter, Georgia became this perfect puppet state of the US, and it was a major irritant to Russia and served as a jumping off point for CIA-sponsored Chechen fighters into Russia. So, I mean, there is a precedent for this kind of thing. We shall see what happens. But I mean, I wish Nepal the absolute best, and I really hope that this isn't a repeat of what has happened so many times before, where the government is replaced by something much worse, as has been the case with every single color revolution in history. I mean, there's this remarkable foreign policy being this. It's a mainstream journal that where spooks and military people talk amongst themselves. And there is an essay published a few years back where the authors admit the color revolutions completely failed. They didn't produce change. They actually, in most cases, made the average people's lives much worse because of Western privatization, because of privatization and neoliberal economic reforms, and
My come to Jesus moment on color revolutions was in 2018 in Nicaragua, which is a country I've been to many times and spent quite a bit of time there, and written about quite extensively. What I observed in 2018 was, all of a sudden, all social media and corporate media and the newspapers, everything imaginable, all of a sudden switched, like a switch was just turned on. And no matter where you looked, Daniel Ortega, the president, who was considered, a pretty gentle, aged man, all of a sudden became a rabid dictator, killing students. It was just like a switch went off. And no matter where you looked or what happened, that was the message. And what I saw is that, there are fissures in every culture and every society and every country. People always want more. And, they're not getting it. So there is always some resentment. And especially if a country is under sanctions and things like that, and their credit is dried up, it's very hard to provide. So there's always something. And if an NGO goes in and starts handing out money to people and giving them jobs, there becomes this loyalty to that. But what was so there it was, a legitimate opposition that was kind of supported by these NGOs that I saw. But what was really odd was that when the switch turned on, a private university all of a sudden became this mecca for terrorism. And all of a sudden, these students built a triage hospital and had all kinds of weapons stored and were able to operate out of this immediately. I was writing about it and I was making jokes. I was like, what is this a college class that they were taught? Is this a homework assignment? How did this happen? It was so incongruous to a private university that they had these wings with all of these tactical elements. And the other thing that was really interesting is they kept calling these students peaceful student protesters, but yet the photos of these peaceful student protesters were these men that had huge muscles. They had like these, they were muscle bound, and they had like bazookas, and they were considered homemade mortar weapons. But they had all of these weapons, and they were in these, professional trained fighting stances, and yet they were referred to as peaceful student protesters. So that was extremely curious, because an 18-year-old boy, a 19-year-old boy is skinny, especially if you've been to these countries. These are not muscle-bound people. They're not Arnold Schwarzenegger. So all of a sudden, when you have this influx of these students that are, muscle bound, you start saying, are they really students, or are they something else? And what came out was that, yeah, they were mercenaries. They were paid mercenaries that were mixed in and causing this, violence and these issues. And then all of the violence that was being done to the police was ignored. And all of the violence that was being done, they burned a radio station, they firebombed it. They did they firebombed hospitals, they firebombed schools and things like that, government offices, police stations. None of that was covered. So I'm just wondering if any of those elements also were things that you've observed in your research on Nepal.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I mentioned, the protests in Nepal got violent very quickly, and the leaders of Hami Nepal and other youth groups tried to distance themselves, from the violence. But like I said, they were on their Discord channel. They were openly talking about the protesters in advance were openly talking about planning for mass violence, asking if anyone had access to guns, people saying that they could make Molotov cocktails. Of course, numerous government buildings were set on fire, including the Prime Minister's residence, etc. So yeah, I mean, but this is like a recurring theme. Like, I mean, it's exactly what happened during the Maidan unrest in Ukraine, where you would have fascist, Western-backed fascist groups like Right Sector or Azov Battalion, who are this kind of openly neo-Nazi paramilitary unit that's fully integrated in Ukraine's armed forces now, and gets like glowing editorials in the Telegraph and the New York Times. Anyway, the point is they would deliberately provoke adverse reactions from the police by hurling bricks and like Molotov cocktails and etc. Or even shooting at them, and then this wouldn't get covered, but the police response would. And there was a National Endowment for Democracy funded media outlet called Hromadski, I think. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it was also funded by Pierre and Midyar, interestingly. That's again a whole other rabbit hole for another day, perhaps. But, I'm sorry?
The Intercept for
yes,
those
indeed.
Is he also, and they wouldn't touch Ukraine. They had critical coverage on some topics, but they won't touch Ukraine. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. And so, like, Hromadski was basically like live streaming the protests, and on top of what's the word? Not reporting and not recording provocative acts engaged in by protesters, and only filming violent reactions from police. They also, because the crowds were indeed vast, there are indications that a lot of people would bust in from other countries to attend. It gave the illusion that there was this huge kind of nationwide support for the government's ouster. If you actually look at polls, and this is a vanishingly rare example of the Washington. I mean, it wouldn't happen now, I guess, now that's owned by Jeff Bezos. But at the Washington Post published an op-ed by two North American academics, where they looked at polling data that showed that that Maidan never had anything like majority support amongst the Ukrainian population. There was not public support for joining the EU or NATO, and even more interestingly, only 20% of protesters polled said that they were motivated by concerns about democracy and human rights. you know, like which we were told was, you know, that they were taking down this evil tyrant. But you know, that wasn't their concern at all. So I mean, we've seen this playbook happen again and again and again. But I think that what one of the key shifts has been after initially advertising the US role in all of these color revolutions at the start of the 2000s, to the point that in 2005, USAID produced this slick magazine called Democracy Rising, where they gave offered very forensic, detailed accounts of how they overthrew the governments of Yugoslavia, Ukraine, Georgia, Lebanon as well, and Kyrgyzstan. You know, it's just like setting out in full detail, along with quotes from the groups they sponsored saying we couldn't have done this without foreign help. Like governments started, particularly like Russia and China, they started wising up to the threat of NED, and then so they banned NED's operations on their soil. And so, you know, because you can't endorse what evil dictators like Putin and Xi are saying, it's now become unsayable that the US sponsors color revolutions around the world. In fact, actually, it's not only unsayable. Your job as a journalist is to rapidly deny any suggestion that this stuff is being that unrest abroad is being fomented by foreign forces. Now, you know, really interestingly, I believe it was last summer, NED, which used to have this very detailed grant database. I think this is something that you might have written about, Jeremy. They used to have this grant database where you could look at what groups were being funded in foreign countries by NED, and almost invariably, whenever there was a protest in some, you know, far-flung part of the world, you could look at the groups that were featured in media coverage of that unrest, go on the NED's website and find out they're funded by NED. And like this is like almost like 100% of the time. They've removed that resource entirely, so you can't see who and what they're funding now. And you know, the NED's avowed purpose was to do overtly what the CIA did covertly before. So I mean, it's a kind of mixed win in the sense that NED cannot withstand public scrutiny now, and people are wise. You know, enough people are wise to what, you know, its functions and the insidious role it plays in overthrowing governments or causing destabilization when governments step out of line, that they've been kind of forced underground. But at the same time, that means that we are left definitionally in the dark now as to who or what is receiving US funding. I think that, you know, were the NED grant records for Nepal available, we could probably, you know, it would potentially offer bombshell smoking gun evidence that this was a US sponsored coup. We don't have that incontrovertible proof, but there are very clear insinuations that this was whipped up by Western powers.
Kit, on that note, please tell our audience how they can follow your important work.
Sure. So you can find my website is www.kitklarenberg.com. You can find a lot of my writing on Grayzone, Covert Action. I also contribute to Mint Press, The Cradle. You can find my Twitter, just at Kit Klarenberg. And I do a podcast with my dear friend and comrade Alex Mackay called Decline and Fall. You can find us on YouTube. Do check in, and yeah, hopefully see you there. Thanks so much for having me on, guys. It's been great.
Thanks, Kit. We learned a lot. I've learned a lot from talking to you.
Thanks, Kit.
My pleasure.
The opinions you hear are ours and that of our guest, not those of WBAI, the Pacifica Foundation, or the Progressive Radio Network. That wraps up our show for today. This is Uncontrolled Opposition. I'm Gloria, Guillo, joined here by Professor Jayme Kuzmarov. Remember to like and share our broadcast. Your kind support keeps us going. Please find us on Substack, Twitter, X, and Podbeam. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you. Bye.
Same to you. You got to go, Kit? I gotta
Yeah,
run.
yeah.
Actually,
Yeah, I've got to
Kit,
run.
we could. I have the. You should write a book on color revolutions. Like
No, I think
you're the world expert on that. And
well,
True.
I'm severely tempted. I am severely tempted, actually.
yeah, if you want me
But
to
thank
help
you.
you, let me know. I can write a chapter or something. But
Real quick,
you're
Kit,
the
we're still live, Kit, but we're done recording for the radio. Just
Okay.
so
Okay.
go ahead and
That's fine.
continue. We'll wrap up
Yeah.
when the conversation's done.
Yeah, well, I have to go, but thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've
me
got
too.
to run too.
Great
But yeah, no,
discussion.
that was
Yeah, I
awesome.
learned a
Thanks
lot.
so
Yeah.
much, guys.
Hopefully, are you
Speak
going to
soon.
publish about Nepal, or you should publish some
Yeah,
articles on that?
I've actually published something today. So
Oh,
on
great!
a
I'm going to check that out because I was I want to look more into that. So
yeah, awesome.
yeah.
God bless you. Take care.
Okay, take care,
Thank you.
kid.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much,
Bye.
Kit. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you,
Thanks,
Gloria.
Jamie.
Thanks,
All right,
Jayme.
everybody who's
Good
watching at
show.
home, thanks
Thanks,
for
Jeremy.
watching, and check out the
Okay.
radio for the
All right,
show
I'll
to
try and
be
put it
on the
on
air.
the Substack before I leave. So okay, I'll put it right away. Thanks, Jamie. See you
All
next
right.
week. Okay,
Thanks, everybody.
bye.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm just going to wrap up the show and close it out. So, all right. That was Uncontrolled Opposition for the week. We'll be back with another episode next week. And thank you for tuning in. I know YouTube is changing their algorithm and making it so it's a lot more difficult for people to find the shows they want and for the creators to get the engagement they're looking for. So if you're still watching us there, thank you very much. And thank you for watching us on Rumble. We're also on Kick. We're on Twitter or X. I prefer the old name. And also we're still on Rockfin. Rockfin is not dead yet, but we're still over there. So wherever you're watching us, thank you very much. And we'll see you next week. Have a good weekend. I'm CheeseSlice, and I'm going to get out of here too. Bye, everybody.